Ladies and gentlemen, we have Byron Dempsey in the house. I've known this guy for a long time. I've known him through different iterations as an entrepreneur. I've known him before the podcast. I've known him during the podcast. And I think there's no after the podcast. It's still during the podcast. But he's now creating multiple podcasts, which is always a sign of loving the podcast world. So wanted to get him on the show to talk about his journey, what it was like before, and also what is he doing right now to have, a sustaining podcast. Byron, welcome to the show, man. It's good to do this recording. I feel like it's been ages in the making, but good to have you, man.
Yeah, I'm keen. I think last time we saw each other was Bali, right?
Yeah, Bali was great. It was good to hang out, good to get some good conversations in. Let's talk about the conversations that you're having on the Driven Young podcast. Made you decide to be the leader of that sort of narrative or this idea that you got to talk to this particular market?
Yeah. So, as you know, we met through KPI and Glenn Carlson. And so when I was younger, 18 years old, actually, I got a job with him. And my job was to follow him around, just making like Gary Vee style video content, definitely his own style. But what that meant was I got to attend all of his workshops, not for free, but I was actually getting paid to attend them. And I essentially got to do the KPI program, which is, I think, 15 grand or something. And so I learned all these skills. And after a year in that world, I was like, oh my God, I didn't learn any of this in school. What we learn in school is not that relevant. A lot of it's very outdated. It's very rare I meet someone who goes, yes, everything we learn in school is super important. And, it's up to date and everything. We can all most people agree there are elements that are quite outdated. And that really led me to kind of start questioning why we're not learning this stuff. And then it was also a combination of, number one, podcasts for me were incredibly beneficial. And in like 2015, 2016, I started listening and I was like 17 years old at the time. And it just opened me up to a whole new world because I didn't do that well at school. Podcasts, like people like Gary Vee and all these guys, they kind of validated that I wasn't an idiot. And they were like, actually, you just aren't made for school and there are other ways to make money and to live your life. And so I guess that combined with the fact that I saw a clear problem. And then the third element was I just spent 2 years, like yourself, Ronsley, learning about becoming a key person of influence and learning how important it was to put yourself out there and build your personal brand. And so those three things, it was like this perfect slot combined with maybe the fourth one was actually going to your event with our podcast for the second time. But then the second time I came, I ran a workshop on using video to enhance your podcast. I stuck around with some other cool podcasters with yourself. And that really got me going, man, what the hell am I doing? Everyone here has a podcast except for me. And I had a lot of like imposter syndrome. And I was like, I can't start a podcast. And this is 2019. So it was right before everyone got onto it. 2020 COVID, everyone blew up and that kind of everyone's got a podcast now. And so there was definitely an element of, wait, am I allowed to start a podcast? Is that something I can do at this age? The fifth element was the podcast allowed me to put out content without it being about me because I was 21 years old and I didn't really know what I was doing. I still don't know fully what I'm doing. I think I know a lot more, but I definitely wasn't egotistical enough to be like, oh, I can start a podcast and just talk about how to nail it your 20s at 21 years old. And so the podcast allowed me to bring on people who had way more life experience or way more expertise in topics like mental health, which I'm not really certified to talk about. And I don't know a huge amount about it, but I can bring on people who do. And I can bring an element of speaking on behalf of someone who's in their 20s. I think that's where I try to keep the conversation around. And the podcast originally started as kind of targeting high school students, but now we've kind of pivoted to more people kind of in their 20s. And the tagline's teaching practical life skills we didn't learn in school. So the conversations are pretty much anything that's relevant to a young person, anything that I think is important that we should be learning, communication, leadership, sex education, all these different ideas, building a brand. That's all the types of topics that we talk about on the podcast.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that, because a couple of things that I wanted to touch on while you were talking, because you mentioned imposter syndrome, you mentioned how you were asking yourself the question, am I even the right person? And those are really important things to happen, because imposter syndrome is a really good psychological phenomenon, forces us to think of the situation we're in. And you've applied it really well because you've gone, well, I don't know anything. That's why the imposter comes in. Because if you had to decide to be the expert, the imposter would have been playing and would have been playing for the very right reasons. And you've decided to quieten the imposter and go, I'm here to learn and be the student of this game. And allows you to actually have an authentic voice versus not. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's because you're right. Like the imposter monster is not inherently a bad thing. Like it's there to keep us in check. Like had I just gone a solo podcast and spoken, I could speak from my perspective, but yeah, I think the podcast is a great little hack where you can overcome that imposter. And now the cool thing about the imposter monster thing is I do not have it whatsoever. Like, because I've been doing it for so long, when you've done a podcast for 2, 3, 4 years, once you've interviewed so many people and you get all these messages from people telling you how amazing the show is and whatever it is, that just starts to slowly disappear and it just becomes who you are.
And that's important. I mean, for me, I've mentioned this more than once on the show, outside the show. Everything I have created in the last decade and more has been because of the Key Person of Influence program. And I've been able to apply those principles, not in one, not in two, but in 3 or 4, actually 5 different businesses that I have started in the last 11, 12 years. And they've always worked out extremely well. Let's talk about your podcast in particular. What is the podcast and how do you create it right now? Like, what is your process before you hit record?
Yeah, so you've actually caught me in an interesting time, but my process is number one, find the guest. Now, either the guest finds me or I find them. Let's say, for example, I find the guest, I would reach out to them. I usually try booking a call. It's just way easier. I don't really go after big name people too much. I like the fact that I have just kind of like average people or whatever I call it. But I did do some really cool interviews in LA. And then we set up a time and then I always do it in person. All my shows are in person. I think the only time I've done Zoom recordings was during COVID and I was really reluctant to do it. That's just because I think the video performs way better. It's a better networking tool for me. It does mean you miss out on heaps of people, but I guess that's something I've kind of decided is big for me. And usually they'll come to me, probably 9 times out of 10, they'll come to my studio. And I really like to give them, I like to say block off 2 hours. That's only for a 1-hour podcast, really. And the first hour or the first 30 minutes is we'll get a coffee. I just really have a chat with them. And I always say, don't share anything too good because I want to hear it fresh on the podcast. And then I always check the pronunciation of their name before I start. I just go, oh, it's Ronsley, right? Yeah, Ronsley. Okay, good. Just so I don't make myself look like an idiot off the bat. And so I'll be like, all right, you ready? Yeah, cool. Hit record. Ronsley, welcome to the podcast. And my question strategy is I open with the same question every time and I close with the same question every time. And then everything else in between, I completely wing it. I don't research my guests a huge amount. Obviously, I do some research, but I don't spend half a day just digging into them because I like to go in from the perspective of the listener. I don't want to be I feel like sometimes I listen to podcasts and they start talking about stuff because you're on the same page, but I don't know anything about any of these two. That's my strategy, at least. And I've gone quite good at asking questions on the fly. I also find a lot of the beautiful stuff happens when you don't plan. The best questions are the one that you don't prepare for, and just being confident in yourself. But the first question I ask is, what did you do after high school? And then the last question I ask is, what advice would you give to an 18-year-old today? Or what advice would you give to someone who's about to enter their 20s and has no idea what they're doing? And then I just wing it from the rest. And then after that, we take the recordings. Ideally, I have 2 video recordings and 1 audio, but sometimes the cameras might cut halfway through, whatever. We throw that up into Premiere Pro. We turn the video into a multicam edit, which means it's just one file when you can switch between the angles. I sync the audio and then I edit the podcast, but I don't really edit my podcast that much unless there's a clear mistake or they clearly say something, I'll cut it out. But otherwise I keep it pretty raw. If someone takes 10 seconds to think of an answer, I'll usually leave that 10 seconds in. That's just my strategy. And then I'll go through, and whilst I'm doing that, this is a really important part, I add markers on Premiere. And these markers pretty much saying this is a good TikTok clip. And so whilst we're going through, I'll add markers. I could do 20, 30, 40 markers in a 1-hour episode. Then we'll go through, write the intro, record the intro, export the whole thing as a video file. Now I'm using Spotify, so I can just upload the video file. So I only need 1 file instead of 2. But if you're not, you just re-export it as an audio. So you've got the video file for YouTube, the audio file for podcasting. Then where the fun part begins, which is where the time really gets sunken into, is going into every single marker, cutting it out, putting it into a fresh timeline. So I use 1 timeline. I'll cut it all out and just have 30 clips on 1 timeline. And then I go through and edit them all, rearrange them, and what I call cut the fat. And when I say cut the fat, you have to be so vicious. If there's a second of an arm or a hesitation, cut it out. Cut out anything that doesn't progress the story. Anything that's not moving the main story, cut it out. And then we export all of those clips and then we kind of post them online. So you can see there's quite a lot in the back ends, and we've got to add the titles as well. Titles is really important, coming up with a good title that engages the audience. Maybe music. Sometimes we do it in the TikTok app. Sometimes we do it on Premiere. But yeah, there's lots of different strategies. My friend even will write the title on TikTok and he'll put a green screen behind it. and then he screenshots that and we upload that onto Premiere and remove the green screen background. That way you're using the exact text and fonts that they use on TikTok, because the whole point is you want to make it look native. You don't want it to look like, oh, someone's edited this. And yeah, then we post 10, 15, 20 videos an episode. Usually we get 1 or 2 go viral. Most of them flop, but that's the strategy. And that's kind of how I built the whole brand.
Wow. You mentioned about how you're making these reels and you're asking these questions. When you're winging it in between, now, here's the thing about winging it. I feel like a little bit more skill that you have in the game. I mean, now you've progressed quite a lot, but when you're first starting out, knowing about your guests is really important. I totally understand coming in from a fresh angle, but I just wanted to clarify for the audience, because I don't want them to take something and run with it with half the idea baked, because I definitely know that I'm a better ball player if I've practiced and I've gone to a few training sessions. And then when I'm on the field, I'm not really thinking, I don't have a plan on how things are going to go. I'm just using the skills that I've learned to be able to be in flow. And that's actually what you're after when it comes to an interview. Just wanted to clarify what you meant exactly by that preparation bit.
Yeah. So I guess, as you say, now that I've got a bunch of interviews under my belt, I am a lot more confident in just winging the questions because I've done it for a while. I have probably questions in my subconscious, which I always bring up. I had my opening question and my last question. Then I had a backup questions I called. And these are questions if I ever got stuck or if the conversation ever came to a halt. It just gave me safety of mind to know I could lead onto these backup questions, which were there. I haven't had to use backup questions for a while because we just get into a flow. And that is, to me, is more like a conversation as opposed to an interview. And there's no right or wrong. I try to keep mine way more conversational, which means I want to have a good show and then just pull the good moments out of it. And that's where my other podcast, actually, the comedy podcast, has been designed specifically for TikTok clips. And so they're kind of 2 different strategies. And we do get a lot more views on that.
Okay. Before I ask you about the second podcast and the TikTok strategy, I know your goal is having this impact on young people's lives. How does Driven Young, and how do you measure that success from the podcast, or do you at all? Is there any correlation between the two?
Yeah, I don't watch numbers really, just because I find that there are benefits, but the negatives outweigh it, in my opinion, just because I get caught up in it. Same with like followers and whatnot. I still think it's important, definitely, to be like tracking that stuff. I think for me, the way I measure it, maybe in a unique way, is based on the messages I get. So I always encourage my followers. I'm always like, guys, please send me a DM. There's like a few thousand people who listen to this episode. I'm sure one of you can send me a DM. I always say stuff like that. And yeah, I've got like a folder of like 500 plus messages. And it's not just, hey, Byron, enjoy the podcast. It's like, hey, Byron, your podcast changed my life. Hey, Byron, I landed an internship at a top law firm based off a networking strategy we discussed on one of your episodes. And I've been telling all my friends about the show. Hey, Byron, I'm 14 years old from Canada and I listen to this podcast in the car with my mum. And for me, that's how I measure success, because those are the ones that just make me feel so amazing. And it shows them actually having an impact. You know, we always compare ourselves to people ahead of us, right? I'm nowhere near as big as a lot of podcasters in the world, but I'm bigger than most because most podcasters don't have any listeners, really. I definitely don't want to get caught into like, oh, looking at the big numbers and just go, look, I mean, I'm making an impact. And the truth is, a podcast, as you would know, whether you have any listeners, there's unbelievable benefits. The networking, the skill set of asking questions, the skill set of communicating effectively. So yeah, there's definitely so many benefits if you have no listeners. I think it's good if you could expand to you have someone on your team doing that. So that way you're not caught in it and you can just have a team member tracking all the numbers and that stuff, because it's still important. But for me, it was just like, I just want to keep doing good work. And the podcast it's now led to my whole company, which is called Driven Young. And I have an entire revenue model. I have a whole program and all these team now. And that started as a base route. It started from a podcast, which just expanded into something big.
That's so cool. I love hearing your story, especially because I knew you before the podcast, and now I know what the podcast has created for you. And even listening now, I'm like, wow, it's really cool that We Are Podcast played some sort of role in that story, because
dude, it played a big one. It was like the push. You know, I'm like 9% there, but the last 10%, not many people can get to. We Are Podcast was, I can do this.
Yeah, wow. Sometimes I don't even realize, what I made back then, and going through what I thought it was a hassle, because it was really interesting with We Are Podcast, the conference especially. It was that I enjoyed doing it. I enjoyed the speaker retreat that happened afterwards. I want to talk about your second podcast. So you've gotten to how many episodes of Driven Young when you decided that you want to create a second podcast, and what made you do it, and how is it different?
There's actually 3 podcasts. So the second one was actually called Consent and Consequences. And after I did an episode with a guy called Brent Sanders, I think he was around episode 35. So he came to my school in year 10 and spoke about sexual assault education. And he's amazing. He's an ex-police officer. He's an incredible speaker. He's been doing it for 25 years and he's incredible. And that episode just went gangbusters. It got millions and millions of views on TikTok. And Brent kind of said, yeah, but I've been interested in doing my own podcast. And I was like, well, what if we did it together? Like, what if I interviewed you? So rather than you have to sit there and have to like talk it out, I'll just interview you. I can do all the back end. I'll do all the work, but you let me use your name and brand and your skill set. And that was pretty much the agreement. There was no exchange of money. It was just an exchange of time. So he came in for a day and we shot an 8-part series in one day. We just smashed it out. And I then spent a whole bunch of hours editing it and we put that up. And in 3 months, we hit 300,000 followers on TikTok off the back of these clips. TikTok took some of them down. The account kind of got a few warnings and stuff just because we're mentioning words, which is crazy because it's educational content. But yeah, I used the same method, grew that to 300,000 followers. And that podcast was a one and done. It's just one season and it's kind of done. We've spoken about doing season 2, but there'd have to be a sponsor involved. There'd have to be a bit more money involved because I just don't have time like I did back then. But Brent's definitely open to it. The third one, which is the one I was mentioning, came from the TikTok strategy. So when me and my mate, who's my best friend now, we moved into a new place, I set up a podcast studio downstairs for Driven Young. And we figured, well, look, we've got the studio here. It's only being used like once a week. We may as well use it. And he said, what if we started a podcast just about stories and we did it specifically for TikTok? And then we started going, oh yeah, that'd be cool. But they need a reason to stay. And we had this idea called like true or false, where we can make up stories and it'll either be true or false. And they have to stay until the very end to find out if it's true or false. We then renamed it to fact or cap because that's like fact or cap is like TikTok lingo that kids use. And we pretty much just started a podcast where literally all we would do is sit down in podcasts and we'd just share the most insane stories we could find from around the world, or we'd either make them up. And you had to guess if they were true or false. And then every single story became a TikTok clip. And then we hit 100,000 followers in like a month. It massively slowed down from there. And we haven't had much growth in the last kind of year because it's been so busy. But yeah, that just kind of took off. And now that's turned into a live show. So the podcast has kind of switched into more of like a live show. We do like live performances. We do the show live. We take the podcast format and make it live. We also do some like dating stuff. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun. And so that was, again, just using that podcast strategy, which now is quite common. But when I started, it wasn't that common.
I love it. You speak about insane stories. What story comes to mind when I ask you, what's the most memorable insane story you have?
Oh, man. You're a true one or a false one? True. There was these 2 twins that they were born identical twins and separated at birth, yet they were named the same name. They grew up and they married a woman with the same name. They then had a daughter and they named her the same name. They then divorced their wife and married a new woman with the same name. They both had the same nickname in high school. And it just goes on and on and on. And it's the most unbelievable, like it sounds completely bullshit. I forget what it's called, but if you search like 2 identical twins separated at birth. But I remember when Pace shared that one with me, I was like, there's no way. But I could talk about this. This is a whole separate podcast. I could talk about these stories for hours.
So cool. And when I say the false one, what comes to mind?
This is probably my go-to false one was there was a woman in the UK who started renting out her apartment on Airbnb. And one of her friends saw her room being used in a porn film. And she went, holy crap, that's not okay. So she contacted Airbnb and they took the people down off the site. But because when you're an Airbnb host, you get to see the history of your guests for safety reasons. She went through their entire history and she started doing some investigating. And over about 6 months, she put a case together to pitch the police that showed that they were actually using this as a sex trafficking ring. And they pitched it to the police. The police then spent the next 2 years researching and going deeper and deeper before they uncovered a full sex trafficking ring and saved 932 women from being sex trafficked based on this Airbnb.
Excuse me. That is crazy because you can believe both of them.
Completely bullshit though.
No, actually, like you could not believe the first one. You could believe the second one. And I love that. That's fascinating. Okay, let's talk about TikTok. The first and most important question, how do followers on TikTok equal either growth in credibility, growth in revenue, or growth in audience?
Not much. I'll be honest, not much. I think people have this misconception that a lot of followers equals money and success and all that sort of thing. I will say for the Driven Young podcast, a huge amount of my listenership came from TikTok. So it very much, I posted one video where I was like, hey guys, 6 months ago, I started posting on TikTok and I posted about this, blah, blah, blah. And that video went viral. And oh my God, that funneled like thousands and thousands of people, which then maintained for quite a while. And so I guess it gave me once you get a bit of momentum, people start telling their friends and stuff. Now, I've never been huge listeners. Like I get a few thousand downloads an episode, probably 5, 6, 7,000 downloads an episode, but it's not huge. I'm making sponsorship money big time or anything. So for Driven Young, for Byron and Pace, which was the Factor Cap story, like almost none would transfer to the podcast. Our theory is because we gave them an open and closed loop. We would start with a question like, is this true or false? We'd end with it. And they had no reason to go watch the rest of the podcast. With Driven Young, I would give them a snippet from the full episode. That's my theory, at least. Obviously, we get some people checking it out. So the transfer to listenership is quite weak and quite low from my experience. I know other people that had more success. The Consent podcast definitely transferred a bit, but still, we didn't get huge numbers on that podcast. We got insane numbers on TikTok. So what happens is, I probably had at one point hundreds of thousands of people saying, oh, I love that podcast about Driven Young. Oh, Driven Young, I love that podcast. And they would never have listened to the show, but they just say they love it because I've seen the clips and I pop up enough on their For You page. So yeah, in terms of credibility, it's great. In terms of ego, it's great. It is good credibility. In terms of conversions for my company, pretty much none outside of maybe it gives me credibility where people feel more comfortable to buy from me. But all my conversions come from paid advertisements on TikTok and Instagram. So my organic, and truth be told, I haven't posted much organically since promoting the program. But yeah, all my revenue comes from paid ads. It's more consistent. It means I can target people in Sydney and Melbourne, which are the 2 cities I run. So that works a lot better. We are starting to do a bit more organic content now. But yeah, truth be told, it's a lot of work and you don't get a huge amount of return. I would say it's less than most people think. People probably thought I had one of the biggest podcasts in Australia, and it was doing well. Don't get me wrong, but it wasn't like huge, like the big hitters that are out there.
I mean, we're always sort of looking at ourselves in comparison to some other person that might not necessarily be in the same bracket or the same sample space as well. But when you're talking about this, you're saying that Driven Young, based on the demographic and who's on TikTok, actually worked for the podcast, which it totally did. It like sort of reversed. It provided audience, it provided credibility, it provided some sort of revenue because you're talking about that. But then it didn't translate to the other ones, primarily maybe because the audience might have been kind of different. And you have some thoughts on why that is because of the open and closed loop. But then when you're talking about giving value and you're getting your returns from your advertising spend, are you getting better returns from advertising spend because you already have these kind of followers? Or does, like, someone starting from scratch, can they just go and do advertising without the content strategy? What are your thoughts on that?
My honest thought is you probably can. When I was working with Glenn, we did these video funnels where people build credibility. Don't get me wrong, that absolutely helps. But I find you can start a business just based on paid ads. And it's hard to know because a lot of people come from Instagram. I only have 6,000 followers on Instagram. A lot of people don't even know who I am and they still sign up to my program. Now, in my webinar where they sign up off a webinar, or I call it an information night for my program, I do talk about kind of what I've achieved. That probably does help. But I think you can kind of just start off with paid ads, start with like business fundamentals, the roots of business. Because the issue is, as you know, you're never going to be able to maintain it if you're not getting a team. Like you probably won't be able to maintain a podcast. You probably won't be able to maintain any form of content. So you're just going to burn out before you even start. So for example, I'm in a period right now where the podcast is one of my lowest priorities. The podcast allowed me to create my program. My program is bringing in a lot of revenue now, and I'm starting to build a team where next year I want to go all on YouTube, and I really want to go all on the podcast. So I've taken quite a big break from the show. I've got like 10 or 12 really good episodes in the bank, which I'm going to be launching for like season 4.
Yep.
And so I'm really excited for those episodes, but it's just too time consuming considering for me, the priority is money, because then I can use that money to last forever. If I just kept doing the podcast, one of the issues I actually faced, Ronsley, when I was doing my program, I was so scared of doing my webinar and filling it up because I thought I would fail, even for the second program. And what I would do is I would trick myself into thinking I was doing good stuff for the business by doing more podcasts. The impact for me to go from 400,000 followers to 500,000 followers will have absolutely zero impact on my life. For me to go from $10,000 to $200,000 a year is going to have extreme impacts on my life, let alone to 500,000 to $1 million a year in revenue. And so I really just the podcast ended up being this thing where I would trick myself into thinking I was being productive. But truth be told, after I'd done 100 episodes, the brand had been quite well built. I did have good listenership, and I had to put myself first, which meant I had to bring in money and look after myself because I just wasn't making any money from the podcast.
It does build confidence, though. It's like a huge confidence builder, especially where you were at in terms of building your brand and learning new things. So I want to land this plane and ask you this question, because I know this is something that I feel strongly about, and because of your program, you feel strongly about. Institutionally, we are taught not to raise our voices because what if people disagree with us? It happened recently to me on Instagram about I wore a t-shirt that people disagreed with, but they didn't read the whole t-shirt. So what I'd love to ask you, with all your experience and all the content you've done and all the young people you've spoken to, what advice would you give young people, content creators, podcasters who want to make a positive difference in the world and the lives of their audience and the people that they kind of want to have this impact on humanity?
Everyone has a voice. Like, everyone has a voice, and there are going to be people out there that'll connect with your message. There are billions of people on this planet. Yeah, billions of them might not connect with it, but if you've got, even a few thousand, that's a beautiful thing. And so, as someone who's been through quite a lot of stuff, the sexual assault podcast, I had a lot of controversy with. We had millions of people, tens of thousands of comments, just like disagreeing, fighting. I'm at the point where I just don't care. And I know what I'm saying is good because it's based on time and research, and it's who I am. But I also think the sign of an intelligent person is your ability to entertain a new idea, not take on that new idea, but entertain it. There's probably people in your life that you love. Your parents might say some stuff you disagree with, but you still love them, right? So long as you have the same values, I would say, or like you have similar values around just, being a good person and those sorts of things, I think you have a voice. Don't be afraid to use it. Start small. Don't worry about the numbers. Worry about how much you're growing as a person. Worry about your own personal journey, because that's the most important thing. I'm only where I am today because of the podcast, and it has nothing to do with the amount of listeners I had or those sorts of things. It's because of confidence, as you said, I built from the podcast. Like, I have no imposter monster now. That's 100% due to the podcast, which then led me to start my first program, which I had imposter monsters for. But now I've done 5 programs. I no longer have that. And so it's just getting over that and recognizing that, yeah, you'll probably get made fun of if you start a podcast, because the culture now is like, oh, another guy starting a podcast, another person just starting a podcast. It's like, who cares? Have fun with it. Like, if you and your friend want to start a podcast, great. It might not go viral. It might not be like a huge success, but you guys will have a fun time. It gives you an excuse to hang out once a week. So yeah, just go for it. You've got a voice. People are going to listen. People are going to make fun of you. They might talk about you in the group chat. They might say things. Just ignore it and give it a crack. Because the worst thing is you fail and you've built more confidence. You've learned from it, and hopefully you can take away some skills from it. That's really the worst case scenario.
Yeah. And to hammer home your point, I knew my dad my whole life, or know my dad my whole life, but I knew him even more after I interviewed him on the podcast.
Yeah.
It was a huge difference. So,
isn't it weird?
Yeah.
That's an essay within itself I could write about. Like, what is that? That's something about the podcast where it just like removes that barrier, especially for guys, where you can just talk. And I think it's very special. And there must be some way we could simulate that without having to make it a podcast and just make it part of life.
I think more and more we need to, because we prefer not having the conversation and we prefer having texts. And there's a lot of things that are changing, especially because of social media. But these conversations are really, really important. Ladies and gentlemen, drivenyoung.com is where you go to find all the cool stuff that Byron is up to. Google Byron's name, because you'll find out that he's got over 14 million likes on TikTok. And he does some incredible work with young people. So go check him out. Byron, this was a little slice of heaven, man. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks, dude.